Imagine a man whose voice reaches tens of millions every single week. A man who has built an empire from a microphone, a studio, and an honest conversation. Joe Rogan, the podcaster, the comedian, the UFC commentator, the cultural phenomenon. His audience is not just wide, it is fiercely attentive, politically fluid, and deeply influenced by every word he speaks. Over the years, Rogan has become more than a podcaster. He is a barometer of American sentiment, a cultural weather vane. What he endorses can sway millions. What he condemns can shake the nation. In 2024, during the heat of the presidential election, Joe Rogan made a choice that sent ripples across the political landscape. He endorsed Donald Trump. For many, this was not just a simple endorsement. Trump had already dominated mainstream media narratives, both praised and vilified across networks. But Rogan's endorsement carried weight that no television anchor or columnist could match. His audience was young, politically independent, skeptical of the mainstream press, and now they had a figurehead guiding their attention. Rogan invited Trump onto the Joe Rogan Experience for an unedited, sprawling conversation that lasted hours. They discussed everything, from the former president's first term to UFOs, from policies to personal philosophy. Millions tuned in. Tens of millions watched on YouTube. The episode became one of the most consequential media events of the election cycle, ranking as the second largest, right after the debates themselves. In this moment, Joe Rogan had transformed from a comedian chatting casually with fighters and guests into a kingmaker, a man whose words could amplify a political figure beyond traditional media constraints. Yet, as influential as he was, Rogan never positioned himself as a politician. He repeatedly reminded his audience, "I talk shit for a living. Don't take my advice." He was the everyman, the neutral observer, the man who could see both sides of a story. This persona gave him unparalleled credibility with his audience. People trusted him not because he was perfect, not because he was an expert on government or policy, but because he seemed human, capable of empathy, capable of skepticism, capable of thought. And that human lens would soon collide with the realities of Trump's second term. By early 2025, the cracks were beginning to show. Trump had secured the presidency once more, but controversy followed him like a shadow. Immigration policies grew stricter, ICE raids became more aggressive, and the tragic death of Renee Good, a 37-year-old volunteer legal observer in Minneapolis, sent shockwaves through the nation. She had been monitoring ICE operations in Minneapolis when she was fatally shot. A video of the incident circulated widely, igniting outrage, confusion, and heated debates. Rogan could not ignore it. As a man who had built his platform on questioning authority and examining all angles, he spoke, and when he did, the nation listened. During a podcast episode, he asked a question that would send tremors through political discourse. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? Where's your papers? Is that what we've come to? The words were simple, yet they carried profound weight. This was not just commentary. It was moral outrage expressed with the calm clarity that made Rogan's voice resonate. Millions of listeners, many of whom had voted for Trump based on his prior endorsement, were forced to pause and reconsider. In this first part of our story, we see the emergence of tension. The man who once stood beside Trump, who once endorsed him publicly and helped galvanize a generation of voters, now begins to express unease, not anger, not hatred, skepticism, frustration, disappointment. For a cultural influencer like Rogan, such a shift is monumental. It is the moment where admiration meets morality, where loyalty meets conscience. And as we will see, this tension will escalate, drawing in controversy, political intrigue, and a national debate that stretches far beyond the studio walls of the Joe Rogan Experience. This is where our story begins. Trump, the media, and Rogan, the swing voter, the everyman, the voice of millions, stand at the edge of a storm. One misstep, one controversial policy, one tragedy, and the balance of influence begins to tip. The questions start forming. Can Trump maintain the support of his most influential endorser? Can Rogan remain impartial while his conscience and the footage of real-life tragedy pull him in the opposite direction? And how will the millions of listeners watching, reacting, and sharing respond to the words of America's most powerful podcaster? The stage is set. The audience is watching, and the story of Joe Rogan and Donald Trump, from admiration to skepticism, from endorsement to questioning, is only beginning. As 2025 unfolded, Joe Rogan's relationship with Trump began to shift in ways that few could have predicted. The man who had once lent his voice to Trump's 2024 campaign now found himself questioning the very administration he had supported. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly in the backdrop of daily news, immigration raids, ICE operations, and high-profile tragedies that could no longer be ignored. The shooting of Renee Good, a 37-year-old volunteer legal observer in Minneapolis, became a tipping point. The video footage of the incident was harrowing. She had been documenting ICE operations, ensuring transparency, when an agent fired through her car window. Rogan watched the video, and as he spoke into his microphone on his podcast, he could not contain the moral outrage that simmered inside him. It's horrible. It's very ugly to watch someone shoot a U.S. citizen in the face, he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Millions of listeners felt the weight of his words. Rogan's critique was not impulsive or reactionary. It was grounded in observation and a genuine attempt to understand the complexity of the situation. He acknowledged the perspective of conservatives, that illegal immigration must be addressed, that law enforcement must enforce the law, that public safety is critical. But he also challenged the overreach, the militarization, the dehumanization of ordinary people caught in the system. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? Where's your papers? Is that what we've come to? The words were simple, yet they carried profound weight. This was not just commentary. It was moral outrage expressed with the calm clarity that made Rogan's voice resonate. Millions of listeners, many of whom had voted for Trump based on his prior endorsement, were forced to pause and reconsider. In this first part of our story, we see the emergence of tension. The man who once stood beside Trump, who once endorsed him publicly and helped galvanize a generation of voters, now begins to express unease, not anger, not hatred, skepticism, frustration, disappointment. For a cultural influencer like Rogan, such a shift is monumental. It is the moment where admiration meets morality, where loyalty meets conscience. And as we will see, this tension will escalate, drawing in controversy, political intrigue, and a national debate that stretches far beyond the studio walls of the Joe Rogan Experience. This is where our story begins. Trump, the media, and Rogan, the swing voter, the everyman, the voice of millions, stand at the edge of a storm. One misstep, one controversial policy, one tragedy, and the balance of influence begins to tip. The questions start forming. Can Trump maintain the support of his most influential endorser? Can Rogan remain impartial while his conscience and the footage of real-life tragedy pull him in the opposite direction? And how will the millions of listeners watching, reacting, and sharing respond to the words of America's most powerful podcaster? The stage is set. The audience is watching, and the story of Joe Rogan and Donald Trump, from admiration to skepticism, from endorsement to questioning, is only beginning. As 2025 unfolded, Joe Rogan's relationship with Trump began to shift in ways that few could have predicted. The man who had once lent his voice to Trump's 2024 campaign now found himself questioning the very administration he had supported. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly in the backdrop of daily news, immigration raids, ICE operations, and high-profile tragedies that could no longer be ignored. The shooting of Renee Good, a 37-year-old volunteer legal observer in Minneapolis, became a tipping point. The video footage of the incident was harrowing. She had been documenting ICE operations, ensuring transparency, when an agent fired through her car window. Rogan watched the video, and as he spoke into his microphone on his podcast, he could not contain the moral outrage that simmered inside him. "It's horrible. It's very ugly to watch someone shoot a U.S. citizen in the face," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Millions of listeners felt the weight of his words. Rogan's critique was not impulsive or reactionary. It was grounded in observation and a genuine attempt to understand the complexity of the situation. He acknowledged the perspective of conservatives, that illegal immigration must be addressed, that law enforcement must enforce the law, that public safety is critical. But he also challenged the overreach, the militarization, the dehumanization of ordinary people caught in the system. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? As Joe Rogan's voice grew louder in the digital world, the ICE raids in Minnesota became a symbol of the growing tension between Trump's policies and the conscience of the American people. The death of Renee Good, a volunteer legal observer, was more than just news. It was a tragedy that highlighted the human cost of aggressive immigration enforcement. Rogan described it with visceral clarity on his podcast. "It's not just a policy, it's a person's life. You're watching someone get shot. That's a human being," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He questioned the defense put forth by the Trump administration. Officials argued that the ICE agent acted in self-defense, that Renee Good had endangered herself and others. But Rogan pushed back with relentless reasoning. He dissected the video footage, he shared eyewitness accounts, and he pointed out inconsistencies in the narrative. "She was turning her car away. How is that justification for a gunshot to the face?" Rogan asked, the weight of moral outrage evident in every word. The podcast reached millions. Comments, tweets, and shares surged as listeners debated the incident. Many agreed with Rogan, feeling a moral discomfort they couldn't ignore. Others, loyal to Trump, questioned Rogan's narrative, calling him biased or politically motivated. But Rogan didn't speak to please anyone. He spoke to provoke thought, to stir conscience, and to demand accountability. It wasn't just the shooting that troubled him. Rogan examined the broader implications of militarized immigration enforcement. He considered how the presence of heavily armed officers in civilian neighborhoods created fear, suspicion, and resentment. He highlighted stories of ordinary Americans, people who had lived in the United States for years, suddenly being targeted due to missing paperwork. Are we really comfortable living in a country where someone can be grabbed off the street because they don't have a piece of paper? Rogan asked, emphasizing the ethical consequences of the administration's actions. The conversation on his podcast expanded beyond immigration. Rogan and his guests explored the interplay between politics, media, and distraction. The Epstein files, still mostly unreleased, loomed in the background. Rogan suggested that high-profile raids and controversies served as a smokescreen, diverting attention from the deeper issues of justice, corruption, and accountability. "Look at what they're doing," Rogan said, leaning close to the microphone. "Everything else is chaos, but the files? Still locked away. It doesn't feel accidental." Listeners began to see a pattern. Rogan's analysis cut through the noise of mainstream media coverage, exposing the gaps between public perception and reality. He illustrated how media outlets, both right and left, often framed the narrative to favor a particular political agenda, sometimes ignoring the human element entirely. Rogan's podcast, Raw and Unfiltered, became a lens through which his audience could view events without the bias of traditional newsrooms. Yet even as Rogan criticized Trump, he maintained a careful balance. He acknowledged the conservative perspective that laws must be enforced, that national security and order are important, but he refused to allow policy to overshadow humanity. He reminded his listeners that every statistic represented a life, a family, a story cut short. This isn't about left or right, it's about decency, about being human in the decisions we make. The discussion extended to social media and political polarization. Rogan highlighted how platforms like X, YouTube, and Facebook had become primary news sources for millions, allowing voices like his to reach audiences that traditional media could not. He emphasized that influence comes with responsibility. Millions of young men, particularly from the so-called manosphere, were tuning in, often aligning their political beliefs with the narratives he presented. Rogan recognized the weight of his words. He was no longer just a podcaster or comedian. He was a gatekeeper of perception, shaping public discourse in ways that could alter political outcomes. As the episode concluded, Rogan left his listeners with questions rather than answers. He challenged them to think critically, to question narratives, and to demand accountability from those in power. "Don't just take what anyone tells you," he said, his tone firm yet earnest. "Look, watch, think, and ask, because the consequences affect real people." This marked a crucial turning point in Rogan's influence. No longer merely an entertainer or commentator, he had become a moral force, a voice that resonated with the frustrations, doubts, and hopes of millions. The clash between Trump's administration and Rogan's conscience was not just political, it was cultural, ethical, and deeply personal. And as the world watched, the question lingered. Could a single podcaster, speaking truth as he saw it, sway the opinion of millions and challenge the authority of one of the most powerful men in the world? The conversation around immigration and justice had taken on a life of its own, and Joe Rogan felt the weight of it more than ever. On his podcast, he didn't just report events, he questioned the very soul of the nation. "We're at a crossroads," Rogan said, his voice tight with intensity. "Do we value laws over lives? Do we value politics over people? Because what happened to Renee Good, that's not politics, that's humanity being ignored." He reflected on his own journey from a comedian and UFC commentator to one of the most influential voices in America. Millions of listeners hung on every word he said, and Rogan understood the responsibility that came with it. But responsibility was complicated. He had supported Trump in 2024, believing in his promises to shake up the system, to make bold choices, and to restore what he called American greatness. Yet now, seeing the consequences unfold, the ICE raids, the shootings, the distractions, Rogan's support had transformed into concern, then skepticism, then moral outrage. The podcaster confronted the administration's inconsistencies head-on. Trump had vowed transparency on sensitive matters like the Epstein files, yet hundreds of thousands of documents remained unreleased. Rogan didn't mince words. "We're being told things are being done, but the proof is hidden," he said, leaning into the microphone. "Actions speak louder than speeches, and right now what we see is deception wrapped in distraction." His analysis was sharp, unflinching, and emotional. Rogan recounted the lives disrupted by ICE raids, families separated, communities terrified, the elderly and the young caught in a bureaucratic storm. Every story he told carried weight, and listeners felt it. "It's not just numbers, these are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and we're supposed to look away because it's politically convenient? That's wrong." Yet he also understood the perspective of those who had supported Trump. He dissected their concerns, crime rates, national security, and order, but he challenged his audience to examine the morality behind those policies. "Yes, laws matter," he said, his tone firm but reflective, "but laws without compassion, without humanity, they become tyranny." As Rogan's podcast spread across platforms, Spotify, YouTube, X, the debate intensified. Clips of his commentary went viral. Discussions erupted on social media. Conservatives accused him of betrayal. Progressives praised his courage. But Rogan wasn't seeking approval. He was seeking truth. He questioned the narratives propagated by mainstream media, exposing how coverage often framed issues to protect political agendas. He emphasized that the public needed to think critically, not just passively accept what was presented. The tension between Rogan and the administration grew. Every new ICE raid, every delayed Epstein file, every controversial political move became fodder for analysis, for moral scrutiny. Rogan's listeners felt the urgency, the gravity. "This isn't entertainment," Rogan said in one powerful moment. "This is about the kind of country we want to be, and right now I'm worried we're losing our way." Rogan's emotional appeal was palpable. He didn't just talk about policies, he spoke about empathy, accountability, and conscience. He painted a vision of America where decisions were measured not just by legality, but by morality. The podcast became more than a show. It was a platform for awakening, a rallying cry for critical thought, and a challenge to the authority of the powerful. By the end of the episode, Rogan left his listeners with a haunting question. If we don't care about the people affected by our government's actions, then what are we fighting for? Power, politics, or the very soul of this nation? The nation was listening, debating, and changing, and at the heart of it, Joe Rogan had evolved from entertainer to moral compass, holding a mirror up to America and to the man he had once endorsed, Donald Trump. The nation was beginning to feel the ripples of Rogan's words. His podcast wasn't just a conversation anymore. It had become a force, a mirror reflecting the cracks in American politics and society. Every segment he released, every pointed question, every emotional plea ignited debate, sparked outrage, and stirred reflection. Rogan's listeners were not passive. They reacted, discussed, shared, and sometimes argued, but they listened, and that was the power he now wielded. He addressed the ICE raids again, painting a vivid picture of fear, confusion, and tragedy. Imagine seeing armed men storm your neighborhood, dragging people from their homes, Rogan said, his voice tight with anger. Imagine innocent citizens being treated like criminals because they happen to lack a piece of paper. This isn't fiction, this is reality, and it's happening under the very administration I once supported. The shooting of Renee Good weighed heavily on him. Rogan didn't shy away from showing his anger, his heartbreak, his frustration. A woman, a human being, shot while doing her job, trying to make sure the system is fair. What kind of government does that? How can anyone defend that? The emotional intensity in his voice struck listeners. It wasn't just a critique, it was a moral indictment. Rogan's critique extended to the Trump administration's handling of the Epstein files. They promised transparency, he said, leaning into the microphone, eyes narrowing. They promised truth, yet hundreds of thousands of documents remain hidden. How are we supposed to trust anything if the truth is buried? His anger was palpable, but so was his sorrow. We're being denied closure, we're being denied justice, and it feels deliberate. He wasn't just criticizing, he was reflecting a sentiment that millions of Americans felt but couldn't articulate. Rogan's words were a voice for the frustrated, the disillusioned, the morally conflicted. I supported Trump because I believed in change, but now I have to ask myself, what kind of change are we seeing? Policies without empathy, power without accountability, politics without conscience? Is this the America we want? Listeners felt the tension, the heartbreak, and the urgency in Rogan's tone. Comments flooded social media, clips went viral, and debates ignited across the country. Conservative supporters felt betrayed. Some applauded his honesty, but many questioned his motives. Progressives celebrated his courage, though they remained wary of his past endorsements. Rogan also confronted the notion of distraction, the idea that ICE raids, media narratives, and political theater were tools to shift attention from more important issues, like the Epstein files. Every headline, every scandal, every outrage seemed designed to pull our eyes away from the truth, Rogan whispered, leaning closer to the microphone, almost conspiratorially. And yet, we fall for it, every single time. The room felt charged, his listeners hanging on every word, emotionally invested, questioning everything they'd been told. He acknowledged the complexity of politics, the difficulty of governance, but he refused to soften his moral stance. It's complicated, Rogan admitted, voice heavy with reflection, but complicated doesn't mean we excuse injustice. Complicated doesn't mean we look away. Complicated doesn't mean we stop asking the hard questions. By the end of the episode, Rogan had transformed a discussion of policy into a call for accountability, a challenge to authority, and a reminder of humanity. His listeners weren't just hearing news, they were feeling it. They were reflecting on their own values, questioning loyalty, and confronting the uncomfortable truths about power, politics, and morality. Rogan's words resonated deeply, echoing beyond the podcast. We can choose to be complicit in ignoring the truth, or we can demand better. We can choose silence, or we can demand justice. What will we choose? The nation was listening. Hearts were stirred, minds were opened, and conversations were no longer just about politics. They were about conscience, accountability, and the moral compass of a country at a pivotal moment. Joe Rogan had done more than critique a president. He had challenged a nation to look in the mirror and to confront what it saw. As the episode reached its climax, Rogan's tone shifted from frustration to urgency. He leaned into the microphone, eyes intense, voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about politics anymore," he said. "This is about influence. This is about the power we give people when we let them shape our reality, when we let them tell us what is true, what is right, and what is worth caring about." The audience could feel the weight of his words. Every listener, whether supportive or skeptical, was pulled into the gravity of the moment. Rogan reminded them that the tools of power, media, politics, social platforms, could be wielded responsibly or abused. "We have a choice," he continued. "We can blindly follow narratives handed to us on a silver platter, or we can demand clarity. We can question motives. We can see the world as it really is." He addressed the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. Once a figure Rogan had endorsed, now a complex character in a story of broken promises, controversy, and moral ambiguity. Trump did things that inspired millions, but he also made choices that forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, Rogan said, voice cracking slightly with emotion. "And I'm not afraid to call it as I see it, because the truth matters more than loyalty. Loyalty to people fades, but loyalty to principles, to justice, to accountability, that lasts." Then Rogan paused, letting silence speak louder than words. The impact was immediate. Listeners felt the pause, the weight of reflection, the moment when entertainment became responsibility. "We all need to wake up," he whispered. "It's not enough to cheer. It's not enough to argue online. We have to think, question, and act, because if we don't, someone else will decide our reality for us." Rogan's final words hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the digital space and into the hearts of millions. "We are the audience, the voters, the citizens, and we hold the ultimate power. Not Trump, not politicians, not media. Us. That's the truth no one can take away." The episode ended, but the conversation was just beginning. Comments exploded, shares skyrocketed, debates ignited across the country. Rogan's podcast had not just informed, it had awakened. It had sparked curiosity, reflection, and moral courage. And here, the Classroom leaves you with this. If you truly want to understand the stories that shape the world, if you want to see behind the curtain of power, influence, and politics, then this is the place to be. Here, we break it down, we analyze it, and we give you the insights no one else dares to share. So subscribe now, hit the bell, and stay tuned, because every episode here isn't just about news, it's about truth, accountability, and the power to think for yourself. Because in the world of politics, media, and influence, knowledge is your ultimate weapon. And here at the Classroom, we make sure you're armed.